Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening. A very, very warm welcome to the Mishcon Lecture 2016. My name is Piet Eekhout. I'm a Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Laws at UCL. I'm also, for my sins, an EU lawyer. I'm not sure for how much longer, but absolutely delighted to be able to chair my first Mishcon Lecture. The Mishcon Lectures were established in 1990 in honor of Lord Mishcon to mark his 75th birthday and in recognition of his achievements and service in the fields of law, education, religion, government and politics, both local and central. And the lecture series were set up by Lord Mishcon's children, Peter, Russell and Jane, who are here, together with, I think, many more members of the Mishcon family, I understand, and even some very young members are attending. And the faculty is extremely grateful for the continued support. Of course, Lord Mishcon passed away in 2006, but we continue the tradition of the lectures, and we're so grateful for the support you offer and to be able to continue organizing this prestigious series. And the lectures are really very diverse and eclectic, reflecting UCL's desire and also Lord Mishcon's own efforts and interests across a range of, be it political, legal, religious, social, economic issues. And so I think the lecture today is no different. Our speaker tonight is well known to all of you, I think, Jonathan Freedland, absolutely delighted. He was willing to deliver this lecture. He's, of course, an award-winning journalist, a broadcaster, an author. He writes the weekly columns in the Guardian since 1997, if I'm well informed. In fact, there is breaking news, even though 1997 is quite some time. There is breaking news today because he won a yearly award of Commentator of the Year just this morning. You see how good we are at UCL in arranging these things. He has been also, of course, a broadcaster, presenter of BBC Radio 4's Contemporary History series, The Long View. He also writes novels, he writes thrillers under another name, Sam Bourne, and 6 of them are actually best-selling thrillers, and I found this actually out today, and I need to read them. They will be on my reading list for Christmas. If anyone's got any spare copies, let me know. He's also really a regular contributor to a range of US publications, including the New York Review of Books, and in 2014 was awarded the Orwell Special Prize for Journalism. And the subject of his talk is Reflections on the Revolution in America. That is not a title which was determined after the 8th of November. It was determined months ago with great foresight. I have to say I walked into my preferred coffee shop this morning on Marchmont Street, and there was a sign on the door, Brexit, comma, and Trump, comma, and now the Wi-Fi is off. That's very good. I think that could be looked at as looking at things with a sense of proportion. But I think it could also be looked at as a slight degree of complacency, and look forward to hearing Mr. Freedland's views on the Trump presidency, and probably no reason for complacency or looking at it in a proportionate way. But please deliver the 2016 Mishcon Lecture, and thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. Thanks to all of you for coming, braving indeed our little unscheduled night hike through the streets of London on our way here. Grateful to all of you. It's a big honor for me to be here, to be giving this lecture in this place. I do feel a family connection, first of all, with both the institutions involved. So both my sons were born at your sister institution, the University College of London Hospital. They were there. I went to school, indeed, at University College School. The house I was in was Bentham, named after the founder of this august institution. So plenty of connections with the institution, but with the Mishcon Lecture itself, it is no exaggeration to say that even as a toddler, the name Mishcon was known to me in my house. And that is because, it often lost in among Lord Mishcon's many storied achievements, was that for a period between, I think, 1969 and 1973, he was the vice president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. And in amongst his responsibilities was to be chairman of the Radio and Television Committee. You weren't expecting to hear about this tonight, I know. But one of the moves he made was that he decided that the Jewish community of Britain needed its own radio program. And he called upon a different Freedland, my father, Michael Freedland, to inaugurate a program called You Don't Have to Be Jewish. And it meant, therefore, that the name Mishcon was beloved in our household because he'd bestowed this wonderful gift on my father. But my father always referred to him as the godfather of his program, You Don't Have to Be Jewish. He regarded him as the godfather of this. Now, you'll remember this program was started in 1971. There was a film of that name that came out at the same time, more or less. And apparently, I'm told by my father that Victor Mishcon, as he then was, having heard that this nickname of the godfather was attached to him, approached my father and said, I'm not sure I like that. This sort of Don Corleone association. But, so there we are, so connected intimately, or anyway, at least personally, with both the University College London and with the Mishcon family, who I see are so amply represented. You referred there to the choice of title, Reflections on the Revolution in America, and it is quite true that we did have to settle on this title in order to promote the lecture some months ago. And it's always a problem, incidentally, whenever you're planning a lecture. Anyone who organised one will know the problem where you have to come up with a title sometimes months or even years in advance for what you're going to speak about in 2018 or 2019. My usual solution to this problem is to say, even if it's a talk booked for 2020, to say, let's call it The Current Crisis in the Middle East. That normally always works, and that's never yet failed me. But this time I took a bit more of a gamble, and I said, let's go for Reflections on the Revolution in America. Now, there's two things at work here, as you know. That, of course, I was playing on Edmund Burke's famous pamphlet, Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790. And with a degree of chutzpah or cheek, I was suggesting that this perhaps be a similar essay in contemplation of these big events. But my confidence in doing that was the belief that even if Donald Trump lost, something revolutionary had happened. And in fact, I wrote a long essay in The Guardian that appeared in May, and it's important that because it's not only before the American election, but before Brexit, in which I said he does not need to win. Donald Trump does not need to win. He does not need to become president. We are already living in the age of Trump. And that's because some of the things I'm going to be talking about tonight were already manifest and already true even then. Nevertheless, it would have been perhaps harder to sustain the argument I'm going to make had Hillary Clinton won. But even so, I think there are things that are true of the campaign, even without the final outcome. With that in mind, I'm going to be talking about the three phases, three ways in which I feel that the word revolution, and let's face it, the word is overused, particularly by people in my business. Journalists throw around the word revolution all the time. In fact, thinking of your experience on Marchmont Street, you know, there will be a headline somewhere today about, you know, Philip Hammond's autumn statement, hailing the revolution in rural broadband. You know, I'm sure that will be there somewhere. It's an overused word and slightly undervalued. So, nevertheless, here I feel it's justified in three ways, three phases, really. I think both before November the 8th, what happened prior to Election Day merits the description of revolution. I think there's a case made for what actually happened on Election Day, the result being at least one revolution. And then in the final section, I will offer some sort of speculative thoughts, but based on the evidence, of what might be revolutionary in what is to come, in the presidency to come. So let's start first of all with before. Why do I say that this was a revolution in America that is to be reflected upon? That is because there has been, and it's been existent for at least 60 years, and in some ways perhaps longer, a rule book of American politics, which journalists like me study, and which political consultants can make, and campaign managers can make a very good living from their mastery of it. And it is a rule book that is not written down anywhere. It's an unwritten rule book, but every politician, journalist, campaign consultant knows the rules. That rule book, even before November the 8th, by June, but certainly by November the 7th, lay in shreds, in tatters. Donald Trump had meticulously, almost as if he was trying to, gone through each page, taken it out, and ripped it up. So the rule book says, for example, that you cannot be, there never has been, elected a president of the United States who has not either had political experience or military experience, usually at a very high level. So the classic example, every post-war president was previously in elected office, with the exception of Dwight Eisenhower, who had been the supreme Allied commander in the Second World War. Absent military experience at that level, you had to have political experience. Donald Trump said, no, that isn't true. I'm going to have no experience, and I'm nevertheless going to aim for the presidency. Campaigns talk about, always using the military idiom, of there being either an air war or a ground war. A politician, a candidate, has to be strong in at least one. By the air war, they mean TV advertising. By the ground war, they mean a ground game, organization on the ground. If you don't have one, you must be strong in the other. Donald Trump came along and was weak in both. Nobody had ever done that before, deliberately so. So in TV advertising, he didn't do any. It was so surprising about somebody who was, you know, a master of the medium. There were, all through the campaign, including in the primaries, very few Donald Trump TV ads. He was outspent in the primaries by the most enormous proportion. He spent in the low single millions, you know, 7, 8, 9 million in TV advertising. To name one rival, Jeb Bush spent $125 million in TV advertising. Somebody worked out that his dollar to delegate earned ratio, he spent something like $70 million on each of the two delegates. He eventually won. Donald Trump didn't do any, because what he did was to rely on free media. He tore up another bit of the rulebook. The rulebook of American television broadcasting says you are invited on political talk shows at a certain time, at a certain date, and you come on and you're interviewed. He would sit there in Trump Tower watching Morning Joe on MSNBC, and he would hear them say something about him, and he would pick up his phone, his own phone, his mobile, cell phone. He would dial the number. He would say, it's Donald Trump, put me on. And they would put him on, and he would be on for 35, 40 minutes. You know, of course, they weren't going to say no. He was the big news story. And thereby, while Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz were paying fortunes for 30 seconds, he was getting 40 minutes free. And this was something he'd learned, incidentally, even in New York. He once asked somebody, one of his aides, to tell him how much the Tiffany, the jewelers, paid for the top third of the top quarter of the right-hand page of the New York Times, and the figure came back $70,000 or something. And he said, well, just watch this. And he called up a reporter of the New York Times, spun him some lie, a nonsense story about building a new building in Rockefeller Center or whatever. The next day there was a story across all of page 3, and he said to his budget guy, his accountant, that cost $70,000. This is bigger, and it cost nothing. So he learned that early. Tore up the rulebook. The rulebook says you've got to have a ground game. He didn't have that either. Reporters all through the campaign were saying, forget the opinion polls, he's got no organization. They would go to Iowa, they would go to Ohio, they would notice a Hillary field office every 5 or 6 miles. There were none for Trump. He didn't do it. So people said he's got no air war, he's got no ground war, he can't possibly win. The rule book says there are certain groups you cannot insult. You just don't do it. Let's start with the most obvious. You don't insult a war hero. You don't insult a well-known war hero who was a prisoner of war for 5.5 years and tortured. Within weeks, days of his announcement in the summer of 2015, Donald Trump was asked about his Senator John McCain, who had been a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He said, not a war hero. I don't consider him a hero. I like the people who weren't captured. They're the ones who are heroes to me. There are pieces everywhere saying, you can look them up, by journalists, credible journalists saying it's over. The Trump campaign is now finished. There is no way you can say that to a Republican audience and hope to win. He said it. You don't insult disabled people. You certainly don't go on television impersonating a disabled person and mocking the way they speak and the gestures they make involuntarily with their arms. Donald Trump did that about Serge Kowalewski, a reporter on the New York Times. Again, people said it's over, it's terminal, you can't do that. You don't begin a campaign by appearing to insult illegal or undocumented migrants, but essentially implying that all Mexicans are rapists and criminals, Mexican Americans. You can't do it. You've lost Mexicans, you've lost the Latino vote. You can't possibly do that. And on and on and on, and of course most famously at both the beginning, middle, and notoriously the end of the campaign, maybe you can insult this group who are 20% of the electorate, Latinos, maybe veterans of 14%. You don't insult a group who account for 52% of the electorate, namely women. You can't possibly do that. In the Republican primary debates, gesturing towards Carly Fiorina, one of his opponents, and saying, who's going to vote for that face, which is what he said. And you know all the other misogynistic remarks he made. Rule after rule after rule he broke. Little side one, service in the Vietnam War for a person his age, man his age, used to be, if not essential, you had to at least apologize and explain. People who've got long memories will remember in 1992 how dearly it cost Bill Clinton that he had appeared to evade the draft. Not only did Donald Trump not serve in Vietnam, joking on TV that he got off because he had bone spurs in one of his feet and joking that he couldn't remember which one, that the doctor had said was the one. He said instead in that period he was very promiscuous and attempting to avoid contracting a sexually transmitted disease that was, quote, my personal Vietnam. Normally you can't do that, right? The rule book says you can't say those sort of things. Norm after norm after norm kept tumbling down. Certainly every presidential candidate of the last 40 years at least had disclosed comprehensive medical records. He released a single paragraph written, his doctor said, more or less by dictation while a limousine waited outside for him to sign it. You knew it was dictation because it was written in the voice of Donald Trump. The doctor said, this man has got the most wonderful health I've ever seen. He's going to be the fittest president there's ever been. He's beautiful. No, there's never been a more beautiful man running for president. You knew it was obviously not a real medical disclosure. It used to matter. It didn't matter. And more seriously, the tax returns, every candidate, going back decade after decade, has released their tax returns. He didn't do it, still hasn't done it. And on and on and on. Every page of the rulebook is in shreds, using foul language. We know the examples. Preparation. It's always said you have to prepare for those TV debates. It's all about preparation. His own staff, fearing he was going to lose, began spinning that there was nothing they could do. They couldn't get him to concentrate. They couldn't get him to prepare. I recommend to all of you as a set text, since we're in a lecture theatre, an interview done in the New Yorker in July with Tony Schwartz, the man who ghost wrote The Art of the Deal and who now feels he's on a mission of contrition, that he has to do penance for having invented this version of Donald Trump. He said that he had an attention span literally in the seconds, 3 or 4 seconds, and he could not concentrate anymore. You would hand him a piece of paper, even a short one, and he would say, I can't bother to read it, tell me what it says. And this, he would not concentrate in preparation for the debates. It didn't matter anyway. And lastly, and most importantly, truth. It is usual that the press corps spend a whole campaign trying to catch out candidates in a lie. And it's big news when they do one. There was a reporter for the Toronto Globe and Mail who took it upon himself to tweet every day a list of the falsehoods Donald Trump had uttered that day. I used to routinely retweet it every night. In the end, he couldn't do it on Twitter. He had to link to a sort of separately established website because it would be 28 today, 39 the next day, good day today, 21 only, 44. They're all compiled. His name is Daniel Dale. You can Google it and you can see the number of lies he said every day. And just to give one, because it was so blatant, he did it in the TV debates, he said, I was against the Iraq War. There is tape. He was on the Howard Stern radio show saying, I support the Iraq War. He was still able to do it. This is why post-truth has been anointed by the Oxford English Dictionary as the word of 2016. So in every single way, the rulebook lies in shreds from this campaign. It's usually said, you know, that whichever, I was in conversation in a public event last week with David Miliband, who said he grew up being told that in any contest, whichever side was the riskier bet always lost. You didn't want to be risk. You wanted to be change, but you didn't want to be risk. And he was reflecting partly on Brexit, which even though it was seen as risk, won. Donald Trump was seen, even by the people who voted for him, as the riskier proposition. Nevertheless, he won. And just there were other things about this campaign, just to close off the campaign part of this discussion, that were revolutionary. We knew already, you know, the fact that social media was in play in this election is not revolutionary. That was true in 2012 and 2008 as well. But this spread of, through social media, of so-called fake news, that was something new in this campaign, where people could read a story, a conspiracy theory, you know, about Hillary Clinton is a devil worshipper. You know, a story like that would be spread, and it would look on your Facebook page identical to a verified, corroborated, thoroughly reported item in the New York Times. That was a big shift. And equally significant was the decline in the United States of the regional press. We don't often talk about that here. Until this time, regional press was seen as tremendously important, and the smart candidates often would ignore the big TV networks and instead do interviews with local, state-level media. This year, every newspaper, except for the Las Vegas Journal-Review, owned by Sheldon Adelson, who was absolutely in the tank for Donald Trump, every other newspaper, major newspaper, either refused to endorse Donald Trump, endorsed no one, or actively endorsed Hillary Clinton, including newspapers that had never in their history not endorsed a Republican. The Arizona Republic, I think the Atlanta Journal was another one, the Dallas Morning News. USA Today never endorsed anyone. They all made a point of saying, this is an exceptional candidacy, we are opposed to it. It did not matter. All of these standards, rules, principles upended in this revolutionary campaign. That is why, even before November the 8th came, I felt there was a case to make that we had witnessed something revolutionary, even if Trump had lost. So that's so much for the before November 7th. What about during? What happened on that day? In Donald Trump winning, does it deserve a description to be described as revolutionary? There is an argument going on, and many of you will have heard it, maybe perhaps participated in it, in which people are trying, there are warring interpretations of what exactly happened there. Both of them, interestingly, will describe it as some kind of revolution, an upending of what we knew before. On the one hand, there are those who say it was an economic upheaval that we witnessed, expressed politically, but economic. And what this says is that this was a revolt by those people, very parallel to the Brexit discussion, who had been left behind by globalization, those who had lost out through globalization, focused in rural areas, what the Americans call ex-urban areas, outside major cities, post-industrial places that had once had mighty manufacturing plants and factories that were now shuttered. Those places shifted from voting Democrat to voting Republican. Evidence cited for this is the states that shifted. You will have seen in the Electoral College that the likes of Wisconsin and Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania all moved out of the Democratic column where they'd been for Obama and into the Republican column. And this, it said, was proof that there was a revolution that was ultimately about economics, in which the left behind shifted their allegiance. And cited as evidence powerfully are the figures that, for example, among white voters who did not have a college education, so blue-collar whites, the vote was 28% for Hillary Clinton and 67% for Donald Trump. So a lopsided victory among blue-collar Americans. And then when you narrow it down to blue-collar men, white, non-college educated men, Donald Trump won those by 72% to 23, 3 to 1. a massive lopsided victory, even in counties, and say some 200 counties that had gone for Obama in 2012, had flipped and gone to Donald Trump. And so the reason why I keep mentioning they'd gone for Obama is this goes to the argument that this wasn't about racism or anything. This was economic pain being expressed in this revolt at the ballot box, a revolution in politics, a realignment where they rallied to Donald Trump, and particularly his message on trade and on jobs, and decided that he was the man for them. Set against that is the view that this was not just about economic pain, or even about that at all, but rather about a cultural shift and in which we would feed in race and indeed gender. And what that cites as evidence is not those figures about the blue-collar vote. This argument says we knew that. The polling always showed that blue-collar white Americans were lining up big time for Trump. That was assumed. That was sort of baked into most people's calculations long before November the 8th. What was also assumed was that big blue-collar vote for Trump would be offset by a big white-collar vote for Hillary Clinton. The polling, we'll talk about polling I'm sure, all said that there was going to be, among college-educated Americans, she was leading by such a margin that even with all those blue-collar Americans, he wasn't going to win. How did he win? Not because he got the white working class. We knew he was going to get those. He won because Hillary failed to get, and Donald Trump got too many of the affluent and the college-educated, those people who could not by any stretch of the imagination be described as left behind. So there were two revolutions going on here. One was, yes, a blue-collar move to Trump, but the other one was a college-educated, affluent group of people who were not repelled by everything we just talked about earlier, the racism or the anti-immigrant message or even the misogyny, but were nevertheless prepared to, in many cases, stick with the Republican ticket and that they usually vote for, and vote for Hillary Clinton. And the numbers there are very telling. On November the 3rd, the Washington Post published an opinion poll which showed Hillary Clinton among college-educated white women 27 points ahead of Trump. And it said, the headline was, college-educated white women are Hillary Clinton's wall, her firewall. Those numbers, if he loses white college-educated women by those numbers, there's no way he can win this election. On the day, what was the margin among that group? Yes, she won them. Hillary Clinton got 51%, but Donald Trump got 45%. Affluent, educated white women went 45% of them for Donald Trump. So that was, the margin was meant to be 27 points, it was 6. And once it was that, there was no way she could win. So people have been talking all the time about Trumpland and left behind and factories, and we weren't listening enough to the blue-collar voters. There is another revolution that happened there that has not been sufficiently attended to, and that is how come a lot of these affluent, well-off, highly educated people doing quite well were prepared to stomach all of those things that everyone had thought were unpalatable about Trump. What was it about that? And therefore, this sort of blue-collar, white-collar thing, those, the poorest, people below $50,000 a year, they all went for Hillary Clinton. It was the people above $50,000 and higher who went for Trump. It was people who were pretty well off. And the anecdotal evidence supports that. From Florida, you would go around areas where people had a yacht. One of my colleagues spotted this in an area of Florida where the really most affluent area, yachts, Trump signs. So this idea that it was somehow only about a working class or a revolution, not so much. So there is this argument. It won't surprise you to know, probably from the way I've been presenting it, I don't think it's either this economic revolt or this cultural thing where suddenly a whole lot of Americans are less liberal in their attitudes than we thought. I think it's both. It was the combination of those two things that allowed Donald Trump to win, both a blue-collar revolt against Democrats rallying to his message for the left behind, and a level of tolerance that surprised the pollsters and people in my business among educated and well-off people for his message. So that's about the during, what actually happened on November 8th. What we come to is the revolution to come. Is there going to be one? Do we need to reflect on a revolution that we are going to witness over these next 4 and possibly, and I really, really wouldn't rule it out, possibly 8 years? And I'll come onto that later. No one said this was going to be a cheery evening, by the way. The optimistic, if you like, camp says, no, it looks awful, but he will moderate. He'll moderate in office. Presidents always do. The institution itself will force him to moderate. And even if he doesn't want to, the institutional restraints on him are so great, there are checks and balances in the form of an independent and separate legislature, the Congress, separate judiciary, the Supreme Court. He will be restrained. There's also a view that says, come on, this was all a pose. This was him. He's a very clever media mogul. This was a performance by him, and he'll moderate once he's got the job. And in fact, there's been some signs, this group interview he did with the New York Times this morning, in which he appeared to disavow a whole lot of things he'd said, including about, lock her up, jailing Hillary Clinton. No, it's time to move on, and I've got a lot of admiration for Hillary Clinton. So people cling to these things and say it was all a pose. And they notice just his choices, and they've noticed that not at the top level, but a level or two below that, that he's already, the transition team at Trump Tower is stuffed with lobbyists. And there he was campaigning against, I'm going to drain the swamp, all this corrupt trade in lobbying, and there are all these lobbyists, and he was confronted about that and said, well, that's all there is down there. Those are the only people who are there in Washington, so I've got to use them and got to hire them. And the final crumb of comfort or piece of evidence, depending on how you look at it, that optimists cling on to is this rumor that Mitt Romney will be chosen as Secretary of State. Well, he looks a pretty sensible chap, and he's an establishment type, and surely if he picks him, that just shows it was all for show, and Trump is going to be a more normal president. And the markets so far seem to be in this camp, this optimistic camp. Look, he's going to spend a lot on infrastructure, and he'll be a more normal Republican. We don't need to be so scared. That's the optimistic view. I, I'm afraid to tell you, am less optimistic on this point. The first reason is these alleged constraints, these checks and balances. I'm a big admirer of them. In 1997, you referred to it, I published, actually it was the following year, a book called Bring Home the Revolution, all about the American Constitution and what a great model it was, and these restraints of the House and the Senate. They are great restraints. But what we have seen revealed in recent years is that they are limited by, or they are restraints to the extent that the people in them, who inhabit those institutions, want to exercise restraint. You have a House of Representatives in Republican hands. You have a Senate in Republican hands. You have currently a deadlocked Supreme Court with a vacancy to be filled by Donald Trump and a Republican Senate. Then he will have the casting vote on that Supreme Court, and the only thing standing between him and having greater control, not just 5-4, but 6-3, 7-2 on the Supreme Court, is the health and mortality of 83-year-old Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And I think Anthony Kennedy, somebody will know, I think he's 87. In this room, you'll know the ages of the justices of the Supreme Court, so I'm not going to speculate any further. But these are not young people, and many people were hoping for a Hillary Clinton victory for only this reason, so they could populate the Supreme Court with liberal judges. He will have control of those institutions. And even if some of the senators and Paul Ryan in the House of Representatives were deeply critical of Donald Trump in the campaign, they're not critical anymore, because he did better in their states than they did. He has a bigger mandate than they have. A Republican who tries to vote against Donald Trump or rebel against Donald Trump will know that Trump will be able to mobilize and organize a primary challenger. Remember, if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you're only ever 2 years away from your next election. They're elected every 2 years. The Tea Party did this, where anyone who was seen as soft, you suddenly found there was a challenger. And a lot of those people, including some of the people who've been very critical of him, have got that hanging over them, that primary challenge. And here's a guy who can say, look, I've done more than you've achieved in years. No Republican had won Pennsylvania since 1988. He did. That gives him more of a mandate. It gives him huge leverage against them. So I don't think you can look with any optimism at those people to hold Donald Trump in check. And this notion of somebody like Mitt Romney, oh, he'll be a restraint. Just cast your mind back 12, 13 years to Colin Powell as Secretary of State for George W. Bush. Lots of people in rooms like this in London and in Europe thought, well, Colin Powell's there. He's a very reasonable, moderate kind of guy. We like him. Yeah, that's why he was Secretary of State, where there's no influence. You're out and in the State Department where you can be safely ignored, presenting an acceptable human face to the rest of the world. And that is what I think Mitt Romney's role would be. So I'm not impressed by that. Another restraint that we should be looking to is the media. Again, I don't feel the signs are encouraging. The precedent from that Bush era is that they were extremely credulous towards power. You know, the reason why The Guardian now has quite a few readers in the United States is because in that period, you could not find anywhere anybody outside The Guardian saying that these claims of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq were bogus. And so American readers had to find that in The Guardian, some skepticism about WMD. They weren't getting it in the American press because the American press's position habitually, traditionally, is quite deferential to the federal government. So Donald Trump, with his 48 lies every day, will now have the federal bureaucracy behind him. How much harder does it become for a newspaper to say, the Department of Commerce yesterday released these figures, we don't think they're true? You know, they found it hard enough to do it when it was just Trump mouthing off. But if it's going to be the official federal bureaucracy, which he will control, I think that's difficult. More importantly, there's something cultural about that. It is very hard for news organizations to cope. It's easy for a news organization to cope with somebody who tells 40 truths a day and then one lie, because you catch them out on the one lie. But if somebody, you know, these are normally the tram lines that most politicians sort of walk through, and occasionally a politician will stray either that side or that side, and you can then, you know, hit the buzzer and make a noise when they wander off. Trump is over here. He's in a different universe, and there isn't kind of the bandwidth for that. And just to give you one example, on Friday, just as an examination of the news cycle, on Friday the story should have been that he had settled for $25 million a fraud lawsuit against him about Trump University. He'd in effect admitted fraud, the defrauding, you know, people who, in a quite sort of pathetic way, wanted to make a fortune selling real estate, the pathos of it, and they'd believed that Trump University. It was a fraud, it was bogus. He paid $25 million. Was that the lead story about Trump the next day? No. The lead story the next day was that he had tweeted a denunciation of the cast of a Broadway musical, Hamilton, saying that they shouldn't have given a lecture to his vice president, Mike Pence. There isn't the bandwidth to cope with 2 of these in a day, or 3 or 4, and yet that's what we're dealing with. So the media doesn't really know how to cope with him, and that's generally, and I think they're going to find it even harder if he makes good on his promise to go after individual news organizations who he doesn't like. And he has already talked about tightening the libel laws. He thinks the libel laws in this country are great. He would prefer those. And he has said directly that he will go after, using the powers of the government, media organizations which have crossed him. So the Washington Post is owned by the founder of Amazon, Jeff Bezos. The Washington Post was quite critical of Donald Trump during the campaign. Trump has said it. It's not me just speculating. He said, Bezos and Amazon are going to have big problems if I'm president. Believe me, big problems. That's a quote. He would go after them. He would use the IRS, the equivalent of the Inland Revenue, Internal Revenue Service, to go after political enemies, people who had crossed him. The normal, restraint, normally that would be an abuse of power. He will think nothing of doing that. So that will be, these are big changes, and I think they deserve to be called revolutionary changes. What about substantively, in terms of policy? Does it count as, what are we about to face on the revolutionary? Well, one thing he's definitely going to try to do, and I think he will be able to do, is a massive infrastructure spending blitz, perhaps up to $1 trillion of investment in roads, bridges, airports. Anyone who's traveled to the United States will agree they certainly need it. And he will do that, and it will be very popular. And this is partly why hovering over our conversation is the 8-year thing. I think this will be extremely popular. Is it revolutionary? I would say not. Hillary Clinton would have tried to do exactly the same thing. She wanted to do it. The difference is, had the very same set of proposals come to Congress with her signature on it, they would have voted it down immediately. This is typical socialist tax and spend. This is profligate fiscal incontinence. We couldn't possibly spend this much money. This will bust the deficit. They would have voted it down. The minute it's got Donald Trump's signature on it, they're all going to lap it up, and they've said so. So I don't think that counts as revolutionary. But some of the other things he's got in mind, he wants to abolish large parts of Obamacare, healthcare. He's proposing a $1 trillion tax cut, 50% of which, incidentally, 50% of that $1 trillion will go not to the top 1%, to the top 0.1%. Those are the estimates that are made. Paul Ryan wants to slash or privatize Medicare. He's going to be Speaker of the House. All of this will be classic republicanism, actually, albeit one on a populist mandate, and therefore not in itself revolutionary. I think many people would deplore it, but I don't think it would be deserved to be called revolutionary. Internationally, now there's something that we should be thinking of in much more dramatic terms. Think about what he said so far about, for example, NATO. In his interview in July in the New York Times, where he said, why do we pay for these countries who don't pay their own way, the Latvias and the Estonias? I don't get where we pay for that. Showing, my second reference to Don Corleone of the evening, showing that his conception of NATO was essentially the same as a mafia don's conception of a protection racket. You know, saying to Latvia, nice little country you've got here, it'd be a shame if something happened to it. You know, you need to pay up if you want Don Trump to look after you. That is his conception of the NATO alliance, and you know, the people most worried in the world about the Trump election are to be found in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. His admiration of Russia. You know, people have analysed his policy statements. He flip-flopped on pretty well everything during the course of the campaign. The one issue on which he was wholly consistent was admiration for Vladimir Putin. He never wavered on that. It was absolutely from the earliest primary contests in Iowa and New Hampshire all the way through to the end. He sees a world run by strong men as being admirable. You know his position on nuclear arms. When he was briefed, he kept on saying, I don't understand if we've got them, why on earth don't we use them? He said that 3 times when he got a military briefing. He has suggested that South Korea should have them, Japan should have them, Saudi Arabia should have them. And those are his positions. And on climate change, his position was that it was a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese. He said on day one he wants to cancel the Paris Accords, which you know Barack Obama worked so hard to broker with the Chinese. In his interview with the New York Times this morning, people have been clinging to this as a crumb of comfort. He softened slightly his hostility to climate change, said there could be some connectivity. He said he had an uncle who was a scientist 35 years ago who used to talk about this. So maybe there is something in there, and I'm definitely in favor of clean air. There should definitely be clean air and clean water to drink. So, which, you know, important issue, but a totally different issue. So he got onto that. So if he were to follow through in all those ways, that would be a revolution in international affairs, certainly since 1945. That the notion of the world as an alliance of values, something like NATO, or even if you're more skeptical and you're not a Wilsonian who believes in an alliance of values, you're a Kissingerian who believes in an alliance of interests. Donald Trump is into something completely different. He's into transactional foreign policy, entirely deal-making, where it's not win-win, it's zero-sum. I win, you lose. If we've both won, then I didn't negotiate hard enough. That is a real change in international affairs. And yet, it isn't the big revolutionary change that I fear most. The big revolutionary change, neither domestic affairs as in terms of policy, nor foreign policy, though that would be massive. The big change would be in terms of America's own governance and its democratic norms. What Donald Trump promises is to, and what he's already done in the campaign, is to show a willingness to trample on the norms that underpin a democracy. I'm not suggesting he's going to abolish elections, but all the rules of the game that make an election meaningful, he has shown a willingness to violate. So, checks and balances, the great gift of the American Constitution to the world, separation of powers. You have to deconstruct what he has said to realize that how he does not understand the meaning of that, or if he does understand it, he has contempt for it. When he proposed that the American government should get into waterboarding and torture, waterboarding and worse, was how he put it, harder measures, torture, it was put to him that that would be an unlawful order in violation of the Geneva Conventions, and soldiers therefore could not follow such an order. His phrase was, let's see if I've actually got the wording, because it's, here it is. But they're not going to refuse, they won't refuse. He was asked, won't they, if military would refuse an unlawful order? His words, in March of this year. They won't refuse. They're not going to refuse me, believe me. If I say do it, they're going to do it. And when he was asked what if they said no, he then said he would sack the generals, even in their hundreds. That is to not understand the separation of powers and the notion that there is rule of law that holds even the president in check. But equally, more subtly, but just as revealing, I thought, in the debates, he kept on saying to Hillary Clinton, you were there in the Senate, why didn't you do it? He kept on saying to her about various healthcare things, you were there, why didn't you do it? He didn't seem to know that as a single senator from New York, you don't have the ability to write the law of the land with the stroke of the pen. He thinks the notion that you have to pass it through Congress and Senate, he seems to not be cognizant of that. Instead, just said, you were there 30 years, you should have done it. And he said many other things that indicate a similar thing. So I think he doesn't, and Republicans, when I covered the convention in Ohio, in Cleveland in July, many Republicans said this to me too. I don't think he's read the Constitution, I don't think he understands it. This was Republicans who were worried about him, who nevertheless, by the way, were going to vote for him because they couldn't stand Hillary Clinton. What are the norms? Just rattling through these and we're going to finish. A free press. I think his contempt for that is obvious. What I said to you before about the way he's going to use the internal revenue to go after Jeff Bezos because of the Washington Post. I think the tweet to the cast of Hamilton demanding they apologize. He tweeted later that night that the cast of Saturday Night Live should give him equal time. The way he keeps going after the press, he had a meeting with all the TV network executives, and he spent the time just calling them out, saying one by one, I'm in a room full of liars, you're a liar, you're a liar, you're a liar. This is not, it seems to me, somebody who understands the importance of an independent and unintimidated press. More importantly, especially this audience in this context of being here in the School of Law, the notion of an independent judiciary as being something central to the United States, I don't think he understands it. What he said about judges and who he would appoint. But at a very revealing moment, it was mainly held up because of the racism. When he said about Gonzalo Curiel, the judge who was going to hear the Trump University fraud case, he said Judge Curiel couldn't possibly be impartial because he's Mexican. It turns out his parents were born in Mexico. He was born in Indiana. And even Paul Ryan, Republican in the House, leader in the House, said it was a textbook example of a racist comment. It was also a contempt for the judiciary to say such a thing. The notion of an independent judiciary. He was trying to bully a judge and believe judges should be essentially political appointees. When he said in those debates, I would lock her up of Hillary Clinton, as if it was in the power of the president, who is prosecuted. And even now in today's interview, he said it again, no, I won't prosecute them, as if it's up to him. Not that there'll be the Justice Department or the Attorney General or the FBI, him sitting behind his desk deciding who he goes in jail and who doesn't, who is prosecuted and who isn't. What other norms are there? Civil discourse. In order for there to be a civil public deliberation, it has to be civil. And I think we know enough about his way of talking that it is not civil. Above all, really, it is this thing of the rule of law. And even today, there are, or in the last 24 hours, fresh evidence of his willingness to disobey or abuse the rule of law. The usual norm is that there is a president puts any interest they have in a blind trust so that they cannot be abusing or corrupting their office for their own personal gain. Jimmy Carter, when he was elected in 1976, had one asset. He owned a peanut farm in Plains, Georgia, that he had built with his own hands. It wasn't good enough to put it in a blind trust. He had to sell it, just in case he was in some international trade talks where his own peanut farm might benefit. He sold it, his life's work. Trump owns buildings all over the world and has said that he will not put them in any kind of blind trust, because that, said Rudy Giuliani, would mean his children had no work to do. So he would keep going with that. And so people say, well, that's bad, because he could be in a conversation with the leader of a foreign government where that becomes part of the negotiation, people imagined, hypothetically. And then 2 conversations have emerged since then. The first one is with the president of Argentina, where the president of Argentina phones him and wants to talk about Latin American regional policy, and Trump says to him, yeah, before we get to that, why are you holding up these permits for the Trump Hotel in Buenos Aires? In other words, if you want the protection of the United States, you have to do right by Trump Incorporated. And little noticed in that exchange with Nigel Farage, because we were all distracted, or rightly focusing on this notion that a sovereign country who had taken back control on June the 23rd should contract out the appointment of its ambassador to an American president. Nigel Farage was very keen on the idea that the American president picks British ambassadors to Washington. We all focused on that bit of the story. Less attention went on this. And Trump today was asked about it by the New York Times and affirmed it had happened. Trump said to Farage, one thing I really want to have sorted out, I don't like those wind farms off the coast of Scotland that ruin the view from my golf courses. And he will say the same to Theresa May. He will say the same. That will be part of the deal. If you want this on Brexit, you want a trade deal, I don't want those wind farms as spoiling the view from the Trump International Golf Course at Aberdeen. He didn't deny it. He was asked about it. This is not abstract, right? This is a direct case of abuse of power and corruption. And here, on this point, is the last thing I'll say before concluding. He was asked about this, Donald Trump, and exactly this point. And he said, the law is totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest. He didn't mean can't in the sense as should not have a conflict of interest, meaning it's impossible to have a conflict of interest because I am the president. And it didn't take a genius to go back to the archive, the famous interview between Richard Nixon and David Frost in 1977. Richard Nixon's words were famous words, which convicted him in the court of history, really, was when the president does it, that means it's not illegal. That was Nixon's understanding. That's why Watergate happened, because he thought he thought he was truly above the law. Trump is not even inaugurated. If Nixon was reflecting on his presidency afterwards, he is not yet inaugurated and said, the law's totally on my side. The president can't have a conflict of interest. He's given no hint that he will do anything about this. To my mind, this trampling on democratic norms, this willingness to place himself above the law, to sweep aside the restraint of the legislature and to have no respect for the independent judiciary, these are revolutionary. And I'm afraid I stand here having taken on, before all of you, the title uttered by Edmund Burke in 1790, when he reflected on the revolution in France as somebody who was fearful. Burke was fearful of what the revolution in France meant for Britain. And I'm afraid I stand here 225 years after Burke, hearing his words echo down the centuries, because I'm afraid I too am fearful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We are, I think, now all a bit more fearful, if that's possible, after your lecture. And Jonathan has kindly agreed to take some questions, and I'm sure there are many questions. We don't have a lot of time, but can I take...
Why don't we do 2 or 3, and I'll try to...
and then answer them. Live in there, and the lady on front here. Can start there.
One of the alternatives you didn't speak to is the possibility that he simply may not be up to the job. He may not, since all we can do is reflect on what he's said, we can't really reflect on anything he's actually done. It may be that he simply is not competent enough to lead a complicated organization like the United States government. He may be more like Obama, that we reflect on things he said rather than things he actually accomplishes.
I have 2 questions. First, I think many people in your business are asking this question today. How do you cover a populist, racist liar without promoting him somehow? And also, you addressed earlier today and wrote about it a couple of days ago, the failure of the left I'm from Israel, and that sounds familiar to me. So I was wondering, how do you explain what seems to be a global weakness of the left?
On your return from Washington as a correspondent for The Guardian in the late 90s, you wrote a book entitled Bring Home the Revolution, The Case for a British Republic, extolling the virtues of American republicanism. Yep. Have you changed your mind?
Good. Do we can take any more, or should we go there? Good. Thank you for those, especially the last one. When the book actually originally came out, the subtitle in the hardback edition was How Britain Can Live the American Dream. And the book came out, and about 2 months after the book came out, the impeachment proceedings began against Bill Clinton over his affair with Monica Lewinsky. And several interviewers took great pleasure in going, how Britain can live the American dream. All a bit of a nightmare now, isn't it? So I feel the echo of that coming down. I still, and the subtitle, the paperback edition did sort of make clearer, I still remain a huge admirer of the American Constitution, and I think actually it is the best hope for restraining Trump, and I remain an admirer of it. There's definitely dysfunctional things going on in American democracy. I don't think those are in the Constitution. Things I would be arguing if I were there is, for example, the corruption of the process financially. You know, the things that Bernie Sanders was campaigning about. There's nothing in the Constitution that stops them dealing with that. It was just that very perverse judgment, Citizens United, which said that, you know, corporations should be treated as if they're human beings and have the right to free speech and even anonymous free speech. So vast corporations could spend money without ever saying who they were. Incidentally, that wouldn't have done anything with Trump. He wasn't using that kind of money. So it's harder. We're in a kind of perfect storm situation where the House, the Senate, the Supreme Court, you know, normally there would be one of those that would be not in his hands. Democrats are assuming that they're going to have a wave election in 2018 and they will be able to retake some of those. But look, I think anybody in my business or any other business should think again. And this is causing, you know, soul searching in me and in others. And I think just shortly after my book appeared, there was a very good book called The Frozen Republic. And it almost argued the contrary case and said America's problem was the Constitution because it was paralyzed by it. And, you know, I did a few discussions with the author of that. The two of us sort of pitted against each other. And I do take that argument seriously. In a way, it's not the Constitution's fault. You know, I don't think the framers thought, here's this document, you must treat it as a biblical text that is never to be interpreted. You know, the example of the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, I don't think they meant that to mean everyone should have a full military-level arsenal and be able to, you know, carry assault weapons. I think they meant states actually should be able to form militias to defend themselves. So the paralysis is partly the American attitude to the Constitution, but we could go deeper into that. But, you know, have I changed my mind? I've certainly interrogated it. I remain an admirer of the American Constitution, but its problems have never been, or America's systems problems have never been clearer than they are today. He may not be up to the job, and isn't it amazing that that counts as a consolation, right? We've got to the point where that's the positive reading, that he may just be not competent. The evidence for that is, besides the, you know, our own eyes, the evidence for that would be the offer he made through an intermediary to John Kasich, the governor of Ohio, who, you know, famously and I think admirably never endorsed Trump, and he was approached before the election and offered to be, he was offered the vice presidential slot to be the running mate, and the offer came, and he was said, listen, it's this very unusual offer, if you take this, you will be in charge of domestic policy. And Kasich was about to react, and then the intermediary said, and foreign policy. So Kasich said, so you want me to be in charge of domestic policy and foreign policy, what's Trump going to do? And the answer was, he's going to make America great again, right? That's what his job's going to be. So that's one item of evidence. And the other is the meeting he had with Obama in the handover. And he more or less admitted, and Obama certainly has, and there's a very good interview in the current edition of The New Yorker, which is really worth reading, where Obama more or less says that Trump had no idea. For one thing, they didn't know that you have to staff the entire federal bureaucracy. It's 4,000 people. Nobody in the Trump camp knew you had to do that. They thought you appointed the top layer, and the rest, they thought it was like Britain, where you have civil servants. That's not how it operates there. They had no idea of that. And it's said that he was pretty shocked. He went a slightly lighter shade of orange when it was put to him what he would have to do. So there is that hope. I'm not sure how that would pan out. I think he's got a lot of people around him who are really invested in it working, who do not want a failure, and whether he himself, does the day job, or whether our influential son-in-law, Jared Kushner, Reince Priebus is a fairly serious operator as chief of staff. I don't think they're going to want it to fail now. So I don't think they would let it fall flat on its face. But look, I mean, that could be how it works. The failure of the left. I wrote something in The Guardian on Saturday about this, how too often in America and in Britain and other places, the left just don't take their gloves off and play by kind of Marquis of Queensberry rules, and the right are much more aggressive. And it's a real dilemma for the left because, the left doesn't want to, and I'm defining the left really extremely broadly to mean everything that isn't the right, really. And they are much more reluctant. They don't want to sort of change, and they want to hold by liberal standards. And you've got such a good example of it going on now. The vote in the popular vote, I think today Hillary Clinton is either about to or has gone through 2 million margin. She has beat Donald Trump in votes by 2 million votes. Now, can you just imagine what Trump would be saying if this was the other way around? In fact, you don't have to imagine it, because in 2012, he thought Mitt Romney, he was wrong actually, he thought Mitt Romney had beaten Obama in the popular vote. He immediately said, this voids the election result, we should have a revolution, people should take to the streets, this shouldn't stand, people are laughing at us, we're not a real country, etc. So that's what they would be saying. And yet the people on the other side think, well, those are the rules, and the Electoral College is what we agreed to, so even though she won by 2 million votes, we probably just should accept it. And that happens again and again and again. And I think there does have to be just a willingness to be much more ruthless and much tougher. And one big thing is to start mastering visceral messages rather than always cerebral messages. You look at the defeated campaigns again and again. Remain did it. I think Hillary Clinton did it. John Kerry did it. Al Gore did it. Where while they're appealing to the gut, their opponent is appealing here and giving, bombarding people with numbers, while the Brexit side say, take back control, which is a sort of visceral message. And the non-right side have got very used to relying on these once-in-a-generation figures who are able to buck this trend. So Barack Obama, they come along once in a generation, a talent like that, who was able to get even those people in those 200 counties that voted for Trump to vote for him. Before him, Bill Clinton. People have forgotten this now because he's a much frailer figure, but he was the most extraordinary campaigner. I saw him close up, and he was a phenomenon. And in a very different context, again, people can't view him through any other lens now than more recent events, but Tony Blair was a once-in-a-generation British politician. If you look at the history of when the left win, they only win when they have these figures. The right can win with extremely flawed people. I mean, look at Donald Trump. So a willingness to get the gloves off, a willingness to speak to the gut rather than just the head, to talk in emotion rather than numbers. These are all lessons that, are going to have to be learned. And we are in the fight of our lives, I feel, people who oppose Brexit and people who oppose Donald Trump. And people who are on that side of the argument, I'm not making any assumptions about people here, but people who are on that side of the argument, you've got to saddle up and get ready for a big fight. And I think in a way, the last 15, 20 years, and maybe in a way the whole post-war era, bred a kind of complacency where people thought this is settled, it can't be undone, and this is established. In 10 seconds, about Europe. Europeans don't fight each other anymore. That's what we did up till 1945. That doesn't happen anymore. No, it really could happen. It didn't happen because the European Union was there to stop the nations of Europe killing each other. But that sense that these complacency, that the left have to get over that. I'm happy to take a couple more, and we can say them all quickly, and I'll try and do one big answer at the end.
I think the gentleman there with the glasses is one of the first to raise his hand.
Well, thanks for cheering us up on this cheerless evening. Is it fascism? Is that what it adds up to? Or is that, I don't know, is that an academic term now? Because if we're to fight it, it's probably just as well that we give it
a name that's worth fighting.
Yeah. Good question. Lady here. Oh, sorry, you're there.
I was interested in what you said about norms earlier, and I wonder if that extends to the Democrats perhaps aping some of the Republican tactics in acting slightly more dysfunctionally. There was an article in this morning's Real Clear Politics that called for Obama to consider a recess appointment for Judge Garland. And they said that he would never do that because Democrats they would think it unconscionable to act so dysfunctionally. But until they start doing so, the Republicans will keep moving the interpretation of the Constitution to the right.
Interesting question. Sorry, I'm doing your job.
You present the long view. What does history have to offer us?
Great question. No, because I want to tell you about that. That's really interesting. Okay. Shall I deal with these ones? Yeah. Is that going to have to be it? I'm very sorry to people who didn't get a chance, but I'll, at the risk of sounding like a Catskill comedian, I'm here all evening, so I can perhaps take questions after. So I'm going to go with that last one first, just because it's so interesting, because we did do a long view on Donald Trump. And the way that this Radio 4 program I don't know if how many of you have heard it, but we take something going on now and we find a historical precedent. And the way we do the program is we have a whole lot now of academics and scholars we get in touch with. And normally you say to them, well, here's Brexit, what's the precedent? And they come up with something. And we got onto all the American history professors, more or less, in the country and said, so Trump, what's the precedent? And people really couldn't come up with one. So in the end, we ended up taking three. This was the stage when he was just a candidate. But there was no one person who embodied all of his. So we ended up doing William Randolph Hearst, who did fight a presidential campaign and was a media mogul. So there was that. Then we had Charles Lindbergh, who was talked about for the presidency. There was a move to draft him in 1940, which became the basis of the brilliant Philip Roth novel, The Plot Against America, which if you haven't read it and don't mind getting more depressed, the resonances are extraordinary. But Lindbergh captured that America First, nativism, anti-immigration, and we have to, this is a whole separate conversation, but the anti-Semitism, which was not then part of the Trump campaign, but became part of the Trump campaign. Lindbergh was all of those. And the third person was Henry Ford, another anti-Semite incidentally, who in 1924 was talked of as a presidential candidate, didn't actually run, but did run and narrowly lost the governorship of Michigan. Put the three together, you get close to Trump, but it was an amazing exercise because it showed there really was no precedent. You had to combine three other people to get close to him. So I don't think there is an American precedent. I do think you have to look to Europe for examples. I'm not yet ready to go into the kind of darkest parallels, but I think Berlusconi is a really good comparison in terms of the control of television, the way he would, he was a post-truth politician actually, and the brilliance he had when all the newspapers, rather he would say the media are against me, even though he controlled huge parts of the media, and he used his TV stations to constantly push out his message. And the more disgusting he was personally, outraging liberals, the more it appealed to his own base, because he was able to say, see, they can't stand me, I'm just like you. And that's what was going on with Trump. I think the really weird aspect of that campaign, the campaign just finished, is that we must now consider the possibility that that hideous tape that was leaked, the Access Hollywood tape in which he talked about essentially sexually assaulting women, that may have actually helped his campaign. And it helped it in the sense that it got Hillary Clinton off her message, which was talking about the economy and jobs, and onto talking about his unfitness to be president. And for huge numbers of voters, including those who you would feel would know better, people who are well-educated, etc., they found those attacks, either they thought, well, they would say that's just the liberal establishment, or they even found it as a sign, an indicator that he was a complete outsider and a maverick. Anyone who can talk like that is somebody who's outside the system. So Berlusconi, I think, is a precedent, and as I say, there are precedents in American politics, but a direct parallel, there has never been a president like this, with no political experience and no military experience, and the financial entanglements, nothing like it. And that's why those historians drew a blank when I asked them about it. Obama, I don't know the mechanics of a recess appointment. Where was that question? That's really interesting to me. You're right, it's exactly the kind of trick the Republicans would pull. I don't know whether he's able to do that without Republican, the Senate having to be some involved. Well, very interesting. So you're teaching me about that. I would say, you know, go for it, is what I would want him to do. And I hope Chuck Schumer is a sort of New York street fighter, and he will use the power of delay and filibuster in the Senate. So I think that's encouraging. But your mention of Obama is helpful because it's something I wanted to mention and I hadn't got to. And it is my one positive thought, my one sort of glimmer of light in all this, which is, but it will require changing breaking the mold a bit. But the most popular person in American politics is on the anti-Trump side of this argument, and that is Barack Obama. And the second most popular person in America, and perhaps the most popular actually, Michelle Obama, who delivered the 2 best speeches of the year. They were hers. And will he, yes, I wasn't making the Melania point, but you're ahead of me. She gave the 2 best speeches. Will he reinvent the post-presidency? Will he think this is uncharted territory? And the idea of just going off and writing my memoirs and, you know, building the presidential library, that option is not available. I need to be the leader of the opposition. You know, will he consider that? I think that's a possible. Just the sheer moral authority. You know, if one more of these sort of norms is violated, and they're falling all the time, will he step forward and say, we just don't do that in this country? And he would be listened to. He can't overdo it, can't do it every day. Not that the leader of the opposition in this country does it every day. But he can't overdo that, so he would have to be careful, but it's something he could consider. Is it fascism? You then said, is it an academic term? It's definitely not an academic term. It's a real thing. And the easy way to answer that question is that already there's a desire to seek euphemism on this subject. And this phrase, the alt-right, is just a euphemism that should not be accepted. You know, this weekend there was a rally, some of you may have seen the footage of this in a Washington hotel, you know, where literally they were doing the Sieg Heil Hitler salute. They were literally saying, "Hail Trump," you know, in that fashion. And the speaker was referring to the press as Lügenpresse, this Nazi term, so, you know, lousy press, I think it means. Richard Spencer, the leader of this group, that was headlined in several places as alt-right. And I want to say there's nothing alt about that, right? There's nothing alternative about that. That's actually old school right. And it's not even neo-Nazi, actually. If they're doing the Hitler salute, that's just Nazi. And the American press find it very hard not to be euphemistic. They are different. The British press is much more direct and robust about these sort of things. So that when Trump would lie, they would often say stretched the facts, or, you know, as if they were talking like John Chilcot. You know, put a weight on the facts that was greater than they could bear. These sort of euphemisms. Fine for John Chilcot, not right when you're taking on somebody like Donald Trump. So, you know, some of these moves suggest heading in that direction, but certainly his supporters, he has fascistic supporters, white nationalist, white supremacist, fascist supporters who have rallied to his message. I didn't pull any punches about the final ad of the final TV ad of the Trump campaign. If you haven't seen it, it's you know, Googleable. It is straightforward, old-school, anti-Semitic propaganda, which he flashes up the images of George Soros, Janet Yellen, and Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs, and says these are the secret global special interests who are sinister, who want to undermine American sovereignty. It is a textbook case. It doesn't need to be parsed or, you know, euphemized. So we have to be much more direct about this and say it as it is. Even our youngest people must lead this charge, I think.
Thank you so much for delivering an absolutely wonderful, even if the message was not the one we necessarily want to hear, wonderful Mishcon lecture. you have certainly shaped my understanding and my perspective on what is going on in United States politics and governance in a way which I think is actually helpful to try to perhaps do something about it. The one question I have, and I'm completely convinced by your depiction of what is happening as a revolutionary event, the one question I have is whether actually the American people have voted for a revolution. And I'm not totally convinced that that's the case. I mean, the numbers are not enormous, the Trump votes, and so I wonder whether this revolution can actually be sort of underground, could take place if there isn't a popular will to support it. So I perhaps put some hope into that. But thank you again so much for joining us, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone. We've tremendously enjoyed your lecture, and I hope you join me. Thanks very much.